Welcome back to the Quiet Channel. Tonight, we're peeling back the veil on a truly eclipsed moment in modern history. A story so isolated, so profoundly silent, that the final evidence defies all logical explanation. We're investigating an event that broke the boundaries of human endurance, making you question everything you thought you knew about the limits of the human body against the forces of panic and the cold. We venture into the deep past of the 20th century to find a riddle that refuses to be solved. A mystery so perfect in its terror that it has spawned theories ranging from military secrets to ancient, unseen forces. Settle in and let the quietness of this journey begin to claim the anxiety of your day. If you find calm in these deep dives into the dark corners of the past, please take a moment to gently like the video and quietly subscribe. Your support is the most essential thing for keeping these long, strange journeys through history continuous and available. Thank you, truly, for listening. I always love to know who is joining us in the dark. Let me know your time zone in the comments. We are a global family here, sharing this quiet search for answers. Now, forget the demands of the day. Dim the light, let your breathing slow, and allow the quiet background hum to pull you deep into the night they fled the tent. We journey now to a cold, remote silence. A vast geological quiet found high in the frozen, unforgiving heart of the Ural Mountains. Transition to a sepia-toned image of the 9 hikers smiling, heavily layered in winter gear, emphasizing their confidence. We are traveling back to January of 1959, to the deep winter landscape of Soviet Russia, where the air itself feels ancient, absolute, and utterly indifferent to human endeavor. Our journey follows 9 experienced student hikers, led by the quiet and steady Igor Dyatlov. They were athletes, engineers, and scientists, young, confident, and utterly prepared for the cold. They knew the mountains, they knew the snow, they understood the mathematics of survival. Their goal was a high-level winter trek to the summit of Mount Ototen. They believed they knew the limits of the human body against the elements. But they were about to encounter a silence and a cold that was entirely outside of their vast experience. The measured movement and the quiet. The early days of the ascent were marked by the reassuring rhythm of the trek, the sound of their progress, the heavy rhythmic crunch of snowshoes, the soft mechanical scrape of their skis, the cheerful sound of their voices echoing across the vast empty plains of the taiga. This was the sound of life, of effort, of control. They were surrounded by beauty and isolation, the kind of deep, profound peace that only true wilderness can offer. We pause on the sensation of that quiet climb, the slow, rhythmic labor of the body, the feeling of the lungs pulling in air so cold it felt sharp, cleansing. The world was reduced to the immediate space of the footprint in the snow, the trail leading steadily upward. The last journal entries and photographs show a group entirely unified, operating with military precision and good cheer. This sense of control is essential to understand the sheer magnitude of the breakdown that was to follow. They were moving into a void, a place named by the local indigenous Mansi people as Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain. It is a name that sounds like the landscape itself, a place already wrapped in a profound historical silence. The Mansi legends speak of the mountain being unsuitable for life, a place where a deeper, older quiet presides. The last official entry in their journals speaks of routine, a small setback, a need to reroute. The last photographs show smiling faces, a group that was unified, confident, and warm. This makes the silence that followed even more jarring. The sudden, complete erasure of their presence from the living world. The feeling of safety was shattered, not by a sound, but by the onset of an inexplicable internal fear. On the late evening of February 1st, the group established their final camp. They chose a spot high on the slopes of Dead Mountain, opting to stay on the exposed ridge rather than descending into the sheltered forest. This decision, in retrospect, suggests that time or safety was of the essence. The weather was poor, fierce winds, heavy snow, forcing them to set up their large tent in a kind of desperate hurry, anchoring it against the fierce, relentless air current that scoured the ridge. The temperature was plunging rapidly, heading toward an unending, suffocating cold that was already demanding all of their focus. Inside the tent, however, the atmosphere was one of immediate warmth and security. They laid out their gear, unpacked their food, and prepared for a final celebratory meal. This was their fortress, their island of light and heat in an ocean of freezing darkness. We can almost hear the soft, muffled sounds of their simple preparations, the quiet scraping of pans, the low murmur of conversation cut off from the shrieking noise of the world outside. The sound of life, contained within the thin canvas walls, was their only defense against the absolute nothingness of the surrounding night. The lantern would have cast a flickering, reassuring light, a beacon of human presence. We linger on that last moment of security, the weight of the collective safety they must have felt. And then, something happened. Not a gradual event, not a slow accumulation of sound or a gradual increase in wind, but an immediate, uncanny silence followed by an immediate internal crisis. The journal entries stopped. The conversation ended. The simple, rhythmic activities of life abruptly ceased. The last action inside the tent was one of sudden, shocking stillness. The evidence left behind suggests a moment of profound, immediate terror, something that forced a decision so illogical, so desperate, that it could only have been driven by an overwhelming present threat. The immediate decision they made was the great, terrifying riddle of the Dyatlov Pass. They chose to trade immediate protection for the profound danger of the cold. They did not simply open the tent flap and step out. They used knives to slash their way out through the canvas walls, fleeing the enclosure in a blinding, desperate panic, running blindly down the slope, away from the light and the shelter. We let the quiet shock of that immediate, catastrophic decision settle around us. The moment when sanity was replaced by pure, desperate flight into the unending cold. The fragile silence of that lonely, high-altitude ridge was violently shattered by a sound that signaled the immediate and utter collapse of rational thought. The slicing, tearing sound of canvas under duress. Imagine the sheer violence of that action in the deep, freezing cold. A frantic, ripping sound, immediately followed by the devastating, paralyzing rush of frigid, snow-laden air blasting into the small, warm haven. The cuts were made from the inside, deliberately, by multiple frantic hands armed with sharp objects. This was not the measured, organized retreat of a prepared group facing a storm. This was the immediate, desperate rupture of safety. It was the sound of instinct overriding training. They did not waste the precious, life-saving seconds required to locate the zipper, to uncinch the drawstrings, or to carefully open the entryway. The fear that drove them was so overwhelming so pervasive, so immediate, so consuming that the delay of an extra second, the delay of even a breath, to use the proper exit was perceived as a fatal, unrecoverable mistake. They had to escape now, not through an orderly exit, but through the nearest available manufactured hole in the canvas. We linger on the sheer irrational force of a primal fear that compels a group of intelligent, trained people to actively destroy their only means of survival and shelter. The fabric of their security was literally torn apart, forcing them into a catastrophic exposure that the cold would never forgive. The sound of that tearing canvas was the final tragic sound of their rational world coming to a sudden, absolute end. What renders this flight so profoundly unsettling and utterly illogical is the bizarre, incomprehensible state in which they left the tent and began their terrifying descent into the sub-zero night without the heavy protection of their proper clothing. Think deeply on the simple, absolute necessity of survival in an environment so hostile. In that frozen region, the very first, most fundamental instinct is to grab the heavy coat, the protective mittens, the sturdy felt boots. These are the absolute and only barriers between the warmth of the body and the immediate certain death delivered by the cold. Yet, they abandoned almost everything. Several hikers wore only socks on their feet, some wore no socks at all, and some had only one boot hastily slipped on. Some were found clad only in their nightclothes or simple shirts, completely exposed to the catastrophic elements. The terror was so absolute and so consuming that the human brain, which is specifically designed to prioritize and execute life-saving measures, had completely bypassed the most basic, most life-sustaining instruction. Dress for the cold, or you will certainly die. The sudden, total abandonment of their entire defense system suggests, terrifyingly, that the threat inside the tent was perceived as greater, more active, and infinitely more immediate than the certainty of freezing to death that awaited them outside. That immediate, illogical decision sealed their fate, a permanent, unchangeable trade of warmth for pure flight. The first desperate movements down the slope were characterized by absolute disorganization. The sparse footprints found later in the thin layer of snow showed a confused, chaotic scatter, not a single file line of hikers, but rather people running, falling, picking themselves up in frantic haste and continuing the frantic, blind rush. They moved toward the relative cover of the distant forest line, nearly a mile away, leaving a silent, chilling trail of desperate haste and incomprehensible terror in the newly fallen snow. The wind on that high ridge must have been brutal, a physical presence, stripping the last vestiges of warmth from their thinly clothed bodies. The feeling of that sudden, shocking, devastating exposure, the air burning the exposed skin, the sudden, paralyzing bite of the cold on the unprotected feet, must have been overwhelming, a physical scream of pain from the body. But they continued. They did not stop. The fear was a profound, overriding, illogical engine that drove their desperate exhaustion past all normal survival limits. They were not running towards any discernible safety. They were running away from something specific, something that remained locked within the tent. The exact path they took was not random. It was a driven, straight-line descent, driven by collective panic, leading directly toward the relative sanctuary of the forest edge. But the paradox remains the single, unshakable riddle. They moved away from the only source of warmth and material protection they had, the fully stocked, defensible tent, and moved toward the deep, silent, dark woods, which offered only marginal, temporary protection and absolute, devastating exposure. We follow the silent, desolate path of those footprints, the only visible record of their final, terrible moments of unified movement. The uniformity and direction of the footprints suggest a group mind, a shared, overwhelming hallucination, or a consensus on a threat so real and so pervasive that it rendered their years of survival training and their combined intellect entirely irrelevant. The initial panic was a catastrophic wave of pure, unthinking emotion that completely washed away the rules of life itself. The shared terror, whatever its source, created a single, fleeing entity that abandoned all rational choice. As they finally reached the forest edge, the extreme, unending cold began its terrible, irreversible work on the unprotected brain. The body's core temperature was dropping rapidly, leading to the rapid onset of severe hypothermia. This stage is characterized not by shivering, but by profound confusion, disorientation, and the frightening onset of irrational, self-destructive behavior. The hikers were no longer capable of thinking clearly or collectively. Their actions became disjointed, driven by a terror that was now compounded by the profound biological breakdown of the mind itself. The ability to make a logical choice, to stop, to return for the gear, to huddle together for shared warmth, was slipping away entirely. The collective panic that began at the tent was now replaced by a fragmented, isolating madness, where each person was utterly alone in the crushing grip of the cold and the residual terror. They had successfully fled the tent, but they were now trapped irrevocably in a far greater, more patient, and more terrifying enemy. The unending cold of the high Siberian winter, which works in a profound and total silence. The final movement was one of fragmented isolation, the last illogical journey of a broken mind. The desperate, chaotic, freezing flight from the utterly compromised and slashed tent led the remaining survivors to the first major, substantial landmark that offered any semblance of marginal temporary shelter. The thick, dense edge of the Siberian taiga forest, positioned nearly a mile down the desolate, utterly unforgiving slope of Dead Mountain. This forest line was not a safe haven, not a paradise of warmth and security, but merely a momentary, brief pause in the terrifying, continuous, relentless exposure. The cluster of large, immense cedar trees stood firm, offering some small marginal break from the direct, slicing, high-velocity wind that continuously scoured the open ridge above. The group gathered, their forms huddled and broken around the base of the thickest, tallest cedar, a silent, unmoving, cold sentinel standing firm against the vast, consuming whiteness. This one monumental tree would tragically become the focal point of the next terrible, illogical, and doomed actions, marking the scene of the first terrible, freezing toll taken by the absolute, unending cold. We pause on the profound physical exhaustion required, the immense effort expended to reach this specific point. They arrived, their minds fragmented, their bodies screaming from the deep, penetrating shock of the cold, their lungs burning from the frantic, half-dressed, nearly naked, run through the heavy, drifting snow. The initial illogical panic, the burst of raw, adrenaline-fueled energy that propelled them out of the tent, was now entirely spent, completely consumed, replaced by profound, paralyzing, overwhelming fatigue. The cold, the vast, absolute cold, had begun its silent, invisible, relentless work of shutting down their essential human systems. Imagine, if you can, the feeling of sinking down, collapsing at the base of that massive ancient tree, the rough, cold bark offering the slightest, most minimal sense of permanence. The dark shadows of the heavy, snow-laden branches offering a necessary psychological shield from the endless, star-pierced, freezing blackness above. It was here, in this marginal, temporary cover, that the collective terror and the fragmenting, debilitating effects of severe hypothermia began to manifest in their final, bizarre, and ultimately doomed attempts at survival. The first order of business, the most basic, most primal, most essential necessity of all, was the desperate, burning need for heat, the need for fire. They attempted, in their confused, freezing state, to build a fire. This was an act of profound, desperate, heartbreaking hope. The very last, final flicker of rational, trained thought remaining in their broken, failing minds. The search parties who later investigated the site discovered the meager, pathetic, inadequate remains of a small, contained fire pit nestled near the Great Cedar. It had been started, briefly, miraculously, and then, tragically, it had been allowed to die, consumed by the sheer force of the cold. We must deeply consider the overwhelming, impossible difficulty of this task. They were without dry matches, without readily available dry tinder, and entirely without the proper tools, having abandoned all sensible, life-saving survival gear in the frantic, illogical flight from the tent above. They attempted to feed the small, fleeting, inadequate flames with whatever meager, frozen materials they could find. They broke off the brittle, dead, lower branches of the nearby pine trees, snapping the lower limbs with raw, freezing, failing effort. The air around them would have been filled with the low, sharp, painful, terrible sound of wood cracking under enormous, debilitating stress, a sound of despair. The effort involved was immense, debilitating, and desperate. The hands of the survivors, numb, freezing, and utterly unresponsive due to the cold, would have struggled to hold and arrange the tiny, precious pieces of kindling. The simple, mechanical action of striking a match or gently blowing on embers to encourage the flame would have been a monumental, heart-breaking labor for minds already consumed by the blinding terror and for bodies rapidly failing due to the cold. The exhaustion alone must have been unbearable. The physical evidence confirms the tragic, brief, temporary success of this attempt. A very small fire, a mere pocket of flickering, weak, ineffective warmth was generated. But it was not enough. It could not possibly counteract the relentless, absolute, penetrating, pervasive cold that was radiating continuously off the ground and descending mercilessly from the mountainside. The fire served only as a momentary, cruel, fleeting reminder of the abundant warmth they had abandoned on the ridge. It was a brief, heartbreaking beacon of life, rapidly and completely extinguished by the vast, patient, indifferent cold of the taiga. The fire died, and the cold claimed the survivors entirely and irrevocably. The next actions they took were the final, ultimate acts of desperate, irrational resourcefulness. The frantic attempts of broken minds struggling to obey the body's final, desperate, agonizing plea for heat. It was around this massive, silent cedar that the first hikers tragically lost their final, exhausting battle against the cold, freezing to death side by side, their journey ended by the relentless, silent enemy. It is here that we find the most disturbing and profound evidence of a deep, agonizing, confused impulse for warmth, and a terrible, devastating form of self-sacrifice. Investigators later found tree limbs broken off at an astonishing height, up to 5 meters above the ground, evidence of a frantic, desperate, final climbing effort. The sheer strength and focus required for this feat, in their current state of utter exhaustion and undress, is almost unbelievable, a testament to the primal power of the will to survive. We are forced to imagine the sound of them scaling the tree, a scrambling, desperate effort to reach dry wood or simply to get off the freezing ground, to gain a small temporary advantage against the all-encompassing, debilitating chill. The bark of the great cedar bore the silent, tragic, scarred record of this final, desperate struggle. Marks, like deep, terrible wounds, were found on the trunk, where hikers had frantically pulled themselves up, tearing away substantial chunks of bark and wood with their bare, frozen, failing hands. The physical trauma recorded by the tree itself speaks volumes about the raw, unfiltered, agonizing panic that consumed them in that final, terrible stand. It was a final, ultimate struggle of pure, primal will against the unyielding, total force of nature. 2 bodies were ultimately discovered near the remnants of that small, failed, futile fire. They were found side by side in a final, heartbreaking, silent embrace, their movements stilled forever, their journey ended. They had tried to protect themselves, tried to share the last fragments of their failing body heat, but the cold was simply too absolute, too vast, too powerful to overcome. The rest of the group, witnessing this immediate, devastating, tragic failure, must have faced a terrible final choice: remain by the futile, dead remains of the fire and surrender to the cold, or continue moving, continue searching, continue hoping for a way to survive the silent, consuming cold. We watch, in the shadow of the great cedar, as the group begins its final, terrible fragmentation. The remaining 7s separating from the dead, forced to continue their desperate, illogical path into the deeper, darker, more dangerous reaches of the Siberian forest. The silence around the tree was absolute, total, broken only by the soft, continuous, chilling sound of the freezing wind, marking the final end of hope. The failure of the small, desperate, quickly extinguished fire beneath the great cedar tree marked a terrifying, irreversible turning point in the tragedy of the Dyatlov group. The remaining survivors, now witnessing the devastating final cold claim the first 2 lives, were forced into an immediate, brutal re-evaluation of their desperate situation. They realized that their continued survival lay not in remaining static, paralyzed by grief or despair, but in continuing the illogical, frantic movement and in engaging in a deeply unsettling yet absolutely necessary form of resourcefulness. The immediate, terrifying presence of the deceased, frozen bodies presented the remaining survivors with a cruel, agonizing, yet desperate opportunity for one last attempt at self-preservation. This is the chapter of the mystery that deals with the cold, unyielding mathematics of life and death. The profound, moral and human dilemma posed not just by extreme survival, but by absolute biological collapse. Investigators would later discover profound physical evidence of what can only be described as a desolate cannibalism of warmth. The deliberate, necessary, and agonizing transfer of clothing, stripped directly from the bodies of the fallen and immediately worn by the bodies of the living. This was not an act of malice, not a moment of robbery or disregard. It was the final, desperate, primal act of the survival instinct, overriding all social conditioning, all ethical training, and every last vestige of civilized human behavior. We must linger on the sheer, immense, agonizing difficulty of this action in the suffocating, deep cold. The bodies would have been rigid, immediately stiffened by the profound frost, their muscles locked. The process of removing layers of clothing, of unzipping, unbuttoning, and peeling off material that was already frozen solid and brittle, would have required a focused, agonizing labor that speaks volumes about the remaining survivor's absolute life or death need for any fragment of protection. The cold was so pervasive, so absolute, so complete, that it dictated every action, every decision, rendering the dead simply into resources. Their identity and their humanity were momentarily reduced to the thermal resistance of the clothes on their backs. The first, most immediate, most instinctive transfer involved the feet. The two victims found nearest the cedar tree were either entirely barefoot or wearing only thin, inadequate socks. The feet are the first to fail in the extreme cold, the first to send misleading signals to the brain, and the most critical area to protect against the descending cold and the biting snow. Therefore, the transfer was likely immediate, driven by absolute non-negotiable necessity. We imagine the desperate, trembling fingers working frantically at the frozen material, the immediate, profound shock of cold contact with the dead skin, the profound, agonizing silence of the action itself, carried out in the deep, all-consuming, terrifying night. It was a silent, heartbreaking transaction of life for life, using the vital, necessary resources of the dead to extend the precious few remaining hours of the living. The most compelling and deeply unsettling physical evidence of this terrible resource transfer was found weeks later on the bodies of the last victims discovered. Those found deeply buried in a ravine in the forest. One of the women, Lyudmila Dubinina, was found wearing a distinct, heavy wool sweater. This garment was confirmed by the initial inventories to have belonged to another hiker, Krivonishenko, who had succumbed earlier and whose body was found near the cedar. This sweater, stripped from the body of her dead comrade, represented a significant life-saving acquisition of warmth, extending her time against the cold, yet simultaneously binding her fate, psychologically and physically, to the one who had already succumbed. The warmth she received was a constant, haunting reminder of the death that had provided it. Furthermore, Lyudmila was also found wearing pieces of cut-off trousers, simple material taken from the other deceased. The fabric was wrapped haphazardly around her feet, a desperate, improvised, fragile attempt to shield her bare skin from the biting, unforgiving snow and ice. This use of material, not as clothing designed for warmth, but as mere wrapping, highlights the profound collapse of social order and the complete, terrifying surrender to raw, primal resourcefulness. The fabric was the only thing that mattered. Its origin, its ownership, its original purpose, all were rendered irrelevant in the absolute, brutal calculus of the cold. The most disturbing evidence of this resource acquisition involved the transfer of the heavy, insulating fur clothing. Another victim, Semyon Zolotaryov, was found wearing Dubinina's heavy, insulating fur coat. This was a critical, high-value piece of equipment, a significant barrier against the cold, and its acquisition proves that the living were actively, deliberately, and systematically taking the best, most protective resources available from the deceased. The action itself, The removal and immediate wearing of the dead comrade's final essential layer of defense is a moment of profound darkness in the human experience. A clear, cold line where collaboration ends and cold, non-negotiable necessity begins. This profound act of transference presents a deeply unsettling moral and ethical vacuum for the modern observer. We are forced to ask the unanswerable. Were these items taken in silence, moments after death, in a desperate, urgent race against the clock, or was there an unspoken, terrifying agreement? A final, silent, mutual understanding among the group that the protective clothing of the fallen was the only remaining hope for the survival of the rest. The profound stillness of the final scene offers no comfort, only the chilling, stark evidence of the exchange. The cold had dictated the final, brutal, dehumanizing exchange of their entire existence. The silence that accompanied this act must have been terrifyingly absolute. No shouted words of protest, no argument, only the strained, ragged breathing and the quiet, awful sound of frozen fabric being manipulated and ripped away in the dark. The cold, by first stripping away their clothes in the panic and then forcing them to reclaim those same clothes from the dead, performed the ultimate, final act of psychological and physical torture. The warmth they gained was instantly tainted by the knowledge of the price paid, a debt that grew heavier and more terrifying with every passing hour they survived. The final, silent inventory of this tragic exchange reveals not only the immense, crushing pressure they were under, but also the profound, illogical desperation that continued to drive their actions. The surviving members were trying to build a new layer of protection, a new defense against the cold, constructed entirely from the shattered, frozen remnants of their group. They were living, breathing monuments to the bodies they had left behind, their survival inextricably linked to the death of their friends. And yet, despite this gruesome, desperate, ingenious attempt at rearmament, the cold was ultimately, inevitably victorious. The transferred clothing bought them precious hours, perhaps a single full day. But it could not reverse the profound hypothermia that had already begun to devour their strength, their focus, their training, and ultimately, their lives. The knowledge of the resource transfer only deepens the tragedy, emphasizing the sheer cold futility of their struggle against an enemy that required absolute, total, immediate protection that they no longer possessed. Their fate was sealed the moment they slashed their tent and fled, half-dressed, into the terrible, unending silence of the Siberian night. Muffled static and low wind continues. Introduce a very subtle, faint, high-frequency distortion or hum, suggesting internal, unseen pressure. The desperate, agonizing attempts to acquire warmth from the dead bodies of their comrades, the profound and dark action documented so chillingly by the subsequent transfer of clothes, ultimately bought the final members of the Dyatlov group only a brief, doomed extension of life. They were moving closer to their end with every single breath they took, their bodies succumbing minute by minute to the insidious, unrelenting cold. The next, most profound, most devastating, and most terrifying layer of the entire Dyatlov Pass mystery lies fundamentally in the physical state of the final victims discovered. Those bodies, found several long, freezing months later, deeply buried under meters of snow in a secluded, remote ravine, far from the site of the failed, pathetic fire. When these final bodies were finally recovered from the deep, icy burial of the spring thaw, the subsequent, crucial medical examinations revealed a set of injuries so bizarre, so extreme, so unique, and so utterly contradictory to the scene of their demise that they instantly pushed the entire tragedy beyond the simple, sad realm of hypothermia and into the territory of the genuinely, terrifyingly inexplicable. These were the silent injuries, terrible traumas of crushing force that left virtually no external visible mark, rendering them the deepest, most complex, and most unsettling riddle of the mountain. The very physical evidence seemed to be in profound contradiction with itself. We must focus intently, intensely, and repeatedly on the paradoxical nature of these devastating wounds. The medical examiners found that several of the final hikers had suffered immense, debilitating, devastating physical trauma. One hiker, Lyudmila Dubinina, had sustained multiple horrific broken ribs, a massive, crushing injury to the delicate, vital structure of the ribcage, and an even more profound, unsettling loss of soft tissue, specifically the tongue. Semyon Zolotaryov, another victim, had also suffered incredibly significant, massive, debilitating crush injuries to his ribs. The level of sheer, raw, destructive force required to inflict these specific, catastrophic fractures is estimated to be equivalent to the immense energy released by a high-speed vehicle crash, or the profound, powerful, immediate impact of a heavy, collapsing object. It was a violence that was both total and instantaneous. But here lies the profound, chilling, unbreakable silence of the physical evidence. There were no corresponding external wounds whatsoever. There were no clear signs of a direct physical struggle on the skin. There were no bruises, no visible hematomas, no deep lacerations, no visible skin damage of any kind, and no immediate evidence of blood on the clothing to indicate such a catastrophic level of force had been applied externally. The crushing injuries were completely internal, as if the massive, destructive force had been generated or applied with a surgical, bizarre precision that utterly defies natural, conventional explanation. The silence of the skin lying perfectly, calmly over the fractured, splintered bone is the single, most disturbing, unshakable paradox of the entire Dyatlov Pass incident. The body was broken, yet the surface remained whole. We are therefore forcefully compelled to confront the central, terrifying, unanswerable question. What kind of phenomenon, what kind of force, what kind of pressure could possibly generate such tremendous, destructive, immediate, focused force without leaving a single external, visible sign of violence, impact, or struggle? The official Soviet investigation, unable to find any physical evidence of a direct struggle with human assailants or the predictable signs of a large animal attack, concluded that the trauma was the result of an unknown compelling force. This conclusion, delivered by official state-sanctioned Soviet investigators, is the single most unsettling, most chilling sentence in the entire official file, immediately creating a massive, terrifying vacuum that the human mind rushes instantly to fill with terrifying, unanswerable possibilities and speculation. Consider the unsettling, pervasive theories that this extreme, focused, silent violence has spawned over the decades. Could they have been caught in a small, localized, extremely powerful avalanche or rock slide? The snow conditions at the time and the complete lack of a large snow mass near the tent or the ravine largely discredit this most convenient natural explanation. Could it have been an encounter with the Soviet military involving some form of high-intensity, physical weapon that applies pressure and vibration without laceration, perhaps a covert test gone tragically wrong. The intense, pervasive bureaucratic secrecy surrounding the entire initial investigation only feeds the persistent, dark, inevitable speculation about hidden tests or covert, disastrous operations. The cold, impenetrable silence of the official reports offers no comfort, only the stark, chilling reality of the fractured, displaced bone. The profound, terrible injury suffered by Lyudmila Dubinina, the complete, devastating loss of her tongue, adds another final layer of unspeakable horror and irrationality to the mystery. This was not a clean removal. The soft tissues of her mouth, including her tongue, were missing entirely, creating a devastating, terrible, silent wound. The immediate, understandable assumptions of human malice or some kind of cannibalistic psychotic act have never been substantiated by forensic evidence. The official medical finding suggests, most unsettlingly, that the loss of the tongue likely occurred after death, perhaps scavenged by small, unseen, desperate animals in the ravine during the long, freezing, silent months before the thaw brought the search parties back. Yet, the visual imagery of the recovered body remains indelible and profoundly haunting. A body recovered in the deep snow, internally crushed by unseen forces, with a silent, profound wound that speaks of a final, terrible silencing. This specific injury, combined with the extreme, crushing internal trauma, pushes the incident deep into the realm of pure, cold nightmare, where the violence is both immense, total, and utterly invisible to the naked eye. The silence of the tongue is the ultimate, final, profound silence of the entire unresolved tragedy. It is the mountain's final, cold refusal to speak the truth. The recovery of these final 4 bodies, locked forever in their bizarrely injured state, confirmed unequivocally that the terror of the Dyatlov Pass was not merely the cold, but an immediate, sudden, devastating encounter with a force, be it natural, human, or otherwise, that was immense, focused, and capable of generating devastating, non-external trauma. The question of what possessed the group to slash their way out of the tent is now amplified tenfold. What kind of external pressure, what kind of physical event could have been so immediately applied to their shelter that it resulted in this specific, crushing internal damage? The lack of any struggle suggests immediate surrender, paralysis, or perhaps a fleeting, immediate loss of consciousness before the crushing force was applied. The silence of their bodies is the silence of the ultimate unspoken answer. The final resting place of these victims, down in the protected, sheltered ravine, is itself an enigma. It suggests that they were actively seeking shelter, or perhaps were attempting to find their way back towards the safety of the forest's deeper, heavier cover. However, the discovery of their clothes, stripped and transferred from the bodies of the others, confirms that their final moments were driven by chaos, desperation, resourcefulness, and a profound, silent internal trauma that speaks of a hidden, terrifying violence that the silent mountain has never fully revealed. The cold silence of the Siberian winter swallowed their screams entirely, leaving behind only the chilling, unbreakable riddle of the bone. The true enemy remains unseen, and the true cause of the silent injuries remains the secret of the snow. The muffled static and low wind continues. Introduce a new, very faint, slow, rising and falling synth note to suggest a soft, ethereal, persistent light source. The sheer cold brutality of the internal injuries found on the final victims, the silent, crushing paradox of massive trauma without a single external mark of violence, pushes the entire Dyatlov Pass investigation far beyond simple, predictable assumptions of survival failure or even direct human assailants. The evidence itself, the very state of the recovered bodies, demands the serious, immediate consideration of forces that are entirely outside the predictable, ordinary realm of normal human experience or conventional, predictable natural events. It is precisely here, in the cold, unforgiving exploration of the truly anomalous, the truly unexplainable, that the entire mystery takes on its most unsettling, most profound, and most cosmic dimension, driven by the compelling, consistent testimony of people who saw something high in the sky that simply should not have been there. This crucial chapter of the narrative delves deeply into the disturbing, scientifically unexplained reports of the uncanny light. Consistent, repeated sightings of strange, glowing ethereal spheres and unidentifiable luminous phenomena observed in the skies immediately above the Ural Mountains, specifically in the very near geographical proximity of the Dead Mountain Ridge, spanning the period both before, during, and immediately following the hikers' catastrophic final night. These repeated reports, often quickly dismissed by skeptics as mere folklore, optical illusions, or simple misinterpretation, were, crucially, meticulously documented and formally filed within the official, state-controlled Soviet investigation records, adding an undeniable, factual, chilling weight to the fundamentally bizarre claim. We begin our investigation into the light with the official reports filed by another, completely unrelated group of hikers. Located approximately 50 kilometers to the south, far away from the Dyatlov group's final silent campsite, this second expedition was climbing in the far southern reaches of the same mountainous region. On the night of February the 17th, a full 2 weeks after the Dyatlov incident had tragically occurred, this second group reported witnessing an absolutely bizarre, awe-inspiring, and profoundly inexplicable spectacle in the clear, dark, cold, unforgiving night sky. They observed a large, spherical, perfect, luminous orb, a ball of slow-moving, silent, powerful light, moving slowly, deliberately, silently across the vast, freezing firmament. The sphere, they testified, emitted a powerful, profound, soft, persistent, yellowish-orange light, moving without the sound, the trajectory, or the predictable flight pattern associated with any known aircraft, satellite, or flare technology of the time. The description provided by the witnesses, trained, rational, experienced Soviet citizens whose jobs required precision, was specific, detailed, and utterly consistent. An immense, silent, slow-moving ball of fire-like light, hanging unnaturally, almost impossibly, in the air. This solitary, compelling report, formally filed and recorded, places an inexplicable, unknown luminous object directly into the geographical area of the tragedy shortly after the event, establishing an essential pattern. However, the persistent, compelling reports of the uncanny light do not end with the distant testimony of faraway witnesses. Perhaps the most critical, most compelling, and most chilling physical confirmation of this phenomenon comes directly from the official, state-sanctioned search and rescue operation itself. Weeks later, as the search team desperately combed the vast, desolate, snow-covered landscape for any sign of the missing students, they too became unwitting, stunned witnesses to the extraordinary, the unexplainable, and the profoundly anomalous presence in the sky. On the night of March 31st, approximately 2 full months after the hikers vanished into the cold silence, multiple members of the military and civilian search party, while stationed near the edge of the Taiga forest, the very same forest where the victims were ultimately found, reported witnessing the sudden, startling appearance of the exact same type of glowing ethereal sphere. This event was not merely seen by one person in the dark. It was witnessed collectively by multiple individuals at the same time, including a respected leader of the search operation. The sphere was described as large, slowly moving, and possessing a profound, almost hypnotic yellowish-orange glow that was entirely unlike the sharp, transient white light of military flares or the familiar red light of standard aviation. The absolute consistency of the description, separated by weeks and miles, and involving completely different groups of trained, sober observers, is profoundly, chillingly unsettling. These were not dreamers or hysterics. These were technical specialists and experienced mountaineers whose very lives and professional reputations depended on the reliable, factual interpretation of their environment. Their collective, repeated testimony forces the narrative to seriously consider the unsettling possibility that a bizarre, unseen, light-emitting atmospheric or non-human phenomenon was actively present and operating on the dead mountain ridge during the precise period of the tragedy. The luminous spheres add a terrifying, silent external dimension to the inexplicable internal crush injuries, suggesting a terrifying cause and effect. The very real presence of these uncanny lights offers a possible, albeit terrifying, explanation for the profound panic that initiated the entire tragic chain of events. One pervasive and deeply disturbing theory suggests that the light spheres, or the advanced technology behind them, could generate a specific form of infrasound, sound waves pitched far below the threshold of normal human hearing, yet biologically capable of inducing immediate, extreme terror, profound nausea, acute dizziness, and mass disorientation. This silent, invisible atmospheric pressure could have overwhelmed the hikers while they were warm, dry, and safe inside their tent, causing a shared mass panic and delusion. A collective, urgent flight from a threat they could physically feel, sense, or perceive, but could not logically identify or visually see. The terror in this scenario would not have been primarily visual. It would have been absolute, overwhelming, biological, and inescapable. An immediate, crushing pressure on the eardrums, an overwhelming, pervasive sense of existential dread and immediate fear that rendered their survival logic null and void. The light itself, the profound, slow-moving, silent orb, may have been a secondary visual factor, or perhaps an immediate confirmation of the incomprehensible source of their terrifying shared pressure. The profound, bureaucratic silence of the official records regarding these sightings is almost as loud and damning as the reports themselves. While the compelling testimonies were officially recorded and preserved, they were later quietly, systematically, and consistently downplayed or outright ignored in the final released state reports. This deliberate bureaucratic suppression only amplifies the weight of the strange phenomena, suggesting that the authorities knew of the uncanny, luminous light, but lacked the capacity, the technology, or the political will to acknowledge its potential direct connection to the hikers' horrific, silent injuries and their bizarre flight. The uncanny light remains the ultimate, final, external mystery of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy. It forces us to ask the most unsettling of questions. Did the students slash their way out of the tent, half-dressed, in a desperate attempt to flee not a bear, not an avalanche, not human assailants, but a silent, glowing, technologically superior presence that applied an invisible, crushing internal force that broke their bodies and shattered their minds? The mountain keeps the secret of the light, but the light itself offers the most compelling and most profoundly disturbing clue yet. The muffled static and low wind continues. Introduce a very subtle, quick, rhythmic clicking sound, like a highly dampened Geiger counter, to imply the unseen presence of radiation. The sheer, cold paradox of the silent injuries, the terrifying internal crushing trauma without any corresponding external evidence, combined with the persistent, inexplicable, and documented sightings of uncanny light spheres in the skies above the unforgiving realm of Dead Mountain, forced the investigation into a realm far beyond normal police procedure and conventional scientific analysis. The totality of the physical evidence, the broken bodies and the eyewitness accounts demanded consideration of forces that were not just external or natural, but potentially technological, military, or even atomic in nature. It is here, in the cold, clinical, scientific examination of the victim's final frozen layers of defense, that the mystery takes on its most profoundly unnerving and most dangerous dimension: the radiation factor. The bodies of the Dyatlov group had been recovered, thoroughly examined, and subsequently released. But the ensuing methodical investigation into their specific belongings, the heavy clothing, the woven fabric, the residual material gathered from the scene, uncovered a final, devastating, and entirely unexpected layer of anomaly. Specific items of clothing taken directly from the last 4 victims recovered from the ravine. The same 4 victims who suffered the non-external crush injuries and the bizarre loss of soft tissue, registered alarming, abnormal, and undeniable elevated levels of ionizing radiation. This chilling finding, though immediately obscured, systematically ignored, and later profoundly downplayed by the official Soviet inquiry, remains one of the most persistent, most difficult to dismiss, and most scientifically verified facts in the entire tragedy, strongly suggesting a profound exposure to a hidden, lethal, energetic force upon the mountain. We must focus intently, clinically, and meticulously on the specific garments that triggered this chilling, terrible alarm. The clothing belonging to 3 individuals, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Lyudmila Dubinina, showed clear, significant, and measurable contamination. Crucially, the sensitive laboratory tests found high concentrations of both alpha and beta particles, the specific markers of radioactive decay. This contamination was heavily concentrated mainly on the outer layers of the fabric, particularly on the heavy fur coat and the thick woolen trousers that had been transferred and acquired in that desperate, tragic cannibalism of warmth. The radiation was not distributed innocuously and evenly throughout the fabric fibers. It was concentrated almost as if the wearers had been in close, immediate, focused proximity to a source of highly concentrated radioactive dust or an immense, sudden burst of intense, localized energy. The official government-issued explanation, offered quietly and dismissively by the Soviet authorities, attempted to rationalize this alarming finding as a simple, routine contamination from the victim's own workplace. Some of the hikers, as students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, were known to have worked in academic laboratories that occasionally handled minor radioactive isotopes. However, this convenient, politically motivated dismissal fails immediately and completely under the intense scrutiny of the physical evidence. The level of contamination found on the clothing was hundreds of times higher than what would be considered acceptable background radiation, or the safe level associated with casual, routine, short-term laboratory work. Furthermore, the very concentration of the radiation, heavy on the outer garments rather than internalized in the blood or bone, which would suggest chronic exposure, points conclusively toward a sudden external exposure event on the mountain itself, not a slow accumulating exposure from weeks or months prior. Imagine the deeply unsettling, terrifying implication that the hikers, in their final confused moments, were exposed not only to unimaginable mass terror and the debilitating consuming cold, but also to an invisible atomic force. The distinct physical presence of this abnormal lethal energy source links the incident directly to terrifying, unsettling theories involving secret Soviet military testing, covert, unauthorized rocket malfunctions, or the accidental deployment of experimental high-energy weapons within the desolate, isolated region. The mountain in this chilling scenario ceases to be merely a high-altitude stage for a tragic natural accident and becomes the profound hidden site of a profound suppressed disaster. The convergence of the physical findings, the crush injuries and the radiation contamination is impossible to separate or dismiss. Could the very force that caused the massive internal trauma, the broken ribs and internal damage, also be the source of the invisible atomic contamination? The specific nature of the injuries, requiring an immense non-impact pressure, lends substantial, unsettling credence to the theory that the hikers were instantly caught near the ground zero of some kind of high-energy burst, possibly a low-level non-nuclear explosion, or the result of intense sonic or electromagnetic pressure. The trauma in this disturbing context would be the tragic physical consequence of a sudden immense pressure wave created by the source of the radiation. The yellowish-orange color of the strange, uncanny light spheres seen by distant witnesses adds a chilling visual component to this technological theory. While highly speculative and visually anecdotal, the specific, profound visual signature of these glowing orbs is sometimes scientifically associated with specific types of atmospheric energy releases or high-energy plasma phenomena, events that are inherently linked to the violent release of high-energy particles and, critically, ionizing radiation. The light that terrified them into flight may have also been the silent, lethal source of their unseen atomic contamination. The persistent, deliberate official refusal to openly discuss or acknowledge the radiation findings is, in many ways, the darkest, most damning clue of all. The Soviet state, pathologically obsessed with maintaining internal secrecy, projecting an image of total scientific control and avoiding political embarrassment, actively suppressed any evidence that pointed directly toward a technological accident or a profound military failure. The very fact that the complex radiation tests were conducted at all, and that the alarming positive results were formally filed and recorded, strongly suggests that the initial investigating authorities were immediately and deeply suspicious of a clear man-made, rather than a purely natural cause for the disaster. Their total silence, The deliberate criminal omission of the radiation factor from the final, publicly released conclusion speaks volumes about the terrible, classified, hidden truth they sought to conceal forever. The tragic, violent fate of the final 4 victims, therefore, was sealed not just by the debilitating cold, but by an invisible, silent, technologically advanced assailant. The radiation contamination offers a concrete, physical, chilling mechanism for the final, terrifying moments inside the tent. The moment of profound shared panic, the irrational, self-destructive flight, and the ensuing silent, crushing injuries. It suggests an external, overwhelming force that broke their bodies and contaminated their very fibers, leaving a clear, atomic fingerprint on the fabric of their tragic, silent end. The unforgiving Ural Mountains continue to hold the final, terrifying secret of the light, the pressure, and the unseen, lethal atomic contamination that sealed the terrible fate of the 9 young adventurers. The relentless, exhaustive search for physical evidence, the crushed bodies, the pieces of transferred clothing, the lingering, faint radiation signature, ultimately provided the Soviet investigators with the chilling what and the bewildering how of the disaster. Yet, crucially, it failed utterly and completely to deliver the single most important answer, the ultimate why. The most human, most profound, and perhaps most frustrating clues to the moments immediately preceding the tragedy were contained in the simple, fragile logbooks and diaries recovered from the abandoned tent, frozen and perfectly preserved within the snow and the shredded fabric of the lost shelter. These notebooks represent the final, living, conscious voice of the 9 adventurers, and the silence that follows their last recorded words is the most heartrending, eloquent testimony of all. We must turn our meticulous attention now to the simple, often hastily written, daily entries scribbled by the hikers, often written in pencil due to the cold, detailing their progress, their morale, and their careful observations of the unforgiving environment. These pages, recovered from the snow, paint a remarkably consistent picture of a successful, cohesive, professional expedition. The entries speak of high spirits, shared jokes, a minor celebratory feast planned for the next day, and meticulous, careful adherence to survival procedures. There is a deep, palpable sense of control and confidence in the prose. The very last entries, written just hours before the catastrophic, life-ending flight, speak entirely of the simple, rhythmic, reassuring activities of setting up the final camp. The routine, the mundane, the normal. One of the final, completely legible entries, scribbled late in the afternoon of February 1st, describes the deliberate decision to set up the tent on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain. The tone used is entirely practical, entirely focused on the need to protect against the brutal wind and the penetrating cold, expressing only slight professional disappointment at the poor visibility, but conveying zero, absolute zero fear or even mild apprehension of impending danger. The words convey the simple exhaustion of a day well spent and the calm, steady anticipation of a well-earned rest and sleep. There is no mention of strange lights in the sky, no mention of unusual sounds, no hint of inexplicable phenomena, and certainly no inkling of impending, profound, terrifying doom. The final recorded thoughts of the living are entirely mundane, entirely normal, entirely human. This profound, persistent normalcy is, ironically, the central horror of the logbooks. The last recorded words are a testament to routine, a firm, steady record of a world operating exactly as it should, entirely unaware that within a few short, devastating hours, everything, sanity, professional training, equipment, life itself, would utterly and completely shatter into primal chaos. The pages immediately following this final entry are, quite simply, blank. The ink stops precisely at that point. The words cease. The record of human consciousness simply disappears into an abrupt, profound, unwritten silence. There is no desperate, frantic scribbling, no visible attempt to record the source of the terror, and no final plea for rescue. Just the stark, total, absolute absence of text. We focus intensely on the chilling final page of the logbook, the literal line where the normal narrative abruptly breaks, where the pen or pencil was set down for the last time. The space immediately below the final word represents the lost hour, the unseen, terrible chasm of time during which the terror erupted. The tent was slashed open and the irreversible flight into the sub-zero night began. The blankness itself becomes the most powerful and descriptive entry of all, the silent, indelible physical record of a catastrophic event that was so immediate, so overwhelming, that it completely overwhelmed the ability of trained, rational minds to even react intellectually, much less record the details for posterity. The logbooks provide profound negative evidence that the terror, whatever its precise source, was instantaneous and overwhelming. Had the threat been slow and gradual, a slowly rising storm, a territorial animal circling the tent, or a gradual deterioration of morale, the trained, disciplined hikers would have continued writing, recording the escalating danger, preparing themselves mentally and professionally for the worst by committing it to paper. The absolute, unbreachable silence that follows the final entry proves conclusively that the danger was instantaneous, total, and required a response that bypassed the intellect entirely, forcing a primal, chaotic physical reaction. The pen was simply dropped as the paralyzing panic took definitive, absolute hold. Imagine the atmosphere in that tent in the final minutes before the rupture. The hikers are engaged in small, quiet, reassuring tasks, preparing dinner, settling into their sleeping bags, perhaps reviewing the map for the next day. Then, without any audible warning, the profound, inexplicable force strikes, be it the silent pressure of infrasound, an energy burst, or the sudden, terrifying appearance of the uncanny light. The time from the onset of the terror to the slashing of the canvas must have been mere seconds, too brief a window for a single, desperate word to be written or even thought clearly. The logbooks testify to the incredible speed and the paralyzing, total nature of the unknown threat. The silent logbooks stand as a permanent, chilling, heartbreaking monument to the sudden, total obliteration of 9 rational, conscious, living minds. They confirm the ultimate, tragic failure of human preparation against a force that was utterly alien to their experience and comprehension. The final word written is not a word of fear or alarm, but a word of routine, a final, cruel irony, a statement of utter normalcy immediately before the silent, violent, and cold descent into the inexplicable. The fragile paper, perfectly preserved by the cold, holds the ultimate secret in its empty, unwritten pages. The cold silence of the final entry remains the unshakable, agonizing truth of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Something profound, something terrifying, something immediate, and something entirely unrecorded happened in that tent that night. The blank page is the undeniable evidence of an event that entirely transcended human language, training, and logical understanding. The logbook remains open, awaiting a final entry that the mountain will forever refuse to allow to be written. We have meticulously followed the fragmented, frozen, and deeply contradictory trail left by the 9 members of the Dyatlov group. The irrational, desperate, half-dressed flight from the abandoned, violently slashed tent. The subsequent, freezing, tragic transfer of clothes, stripped directly from the bodies of the dead. The crushing, silent paradox of the massive internal injuries. Trauma without external impact. The bizarre, persistent, documented sightings of uncanny, glowing lights in the vast, cold sky. And the chilling, undeniable scientific evidence of an atomic contamination left on the very fabric of their clothing. Furthermore, we have examined the profound, terrifying blankness that immediately follows the final, mundane, peaceful entry in their logbooks. Now, after carefully gathering, analyzing, and contrasting these 5 utterly strange and mutually contradictory pieces of physical and testimonial data, we must attempt the truly impossible: to synthesize these profound, strange clues, the trauma, the light, the radiation, the panic, and the silence, into a single, cohesive, horrifying, and singular narrative. This crucial endeavor takes us directly to the formulation of the ultimate theory of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a comprehensive, terrifying hypothesis that meticulously weaves together the confirmed scientific anomalies with the deepest, most primal, and most chaotic human reaction to unknown, overwhelming forces. This theory posits unequivocally and decisively that the group was tragically, fatally exposed to a sudden, highly localized, man-made phenomenon. An event so immense and so rapid that it simultaneously broke their bodies from the inside and completely shattered their minds in an instant, rendering all their professional training utterly useless. The central, initiating, terrifying mechanism of this ultimate, unsettling theory is the infrasound wave, a silent, invisible tide of energetic pressure. Infrasound, or sound pitched profoundly below the threshold of normal human hearing, is known scientifically to have devastating, profound psychological and physiological effects on the human body, capable of inducing intense fear, extreme distress, and complete paralysis of rational thought. While it can be naturally generated by high winds interacting with the specific, deep geological features of a mountain ridge, a theory in itself, it is far more powerfully and far more compellingly in this cold technological context, generated by specific high-energy, low-frequency technological sources or devices. We propose that the uncanny lights seen repeatedly by trained, credible witnesses were not simple atmospheric tricks or benign visual misinterpretations, but the visible, luminous, chilling manifestation of a highly classified technological test, perhaps a rogue experimental rocket component, or a powerful, highly classified sonic or directed energy weapon being tested and deployed in the desolate, isolated region. The source, whatever its exact classified nature, passed directly over or perilously near the ridge on the tragic night of February 1st, emitting 2 fatal, simultaneous, and entirely invisible products: ionizing radiation and an immense, highly localized wave of infrasound pressure. The sheer infrared pressure wave, penetrating the thin canvas walls of the tent with disarming ease, would have struck the hikers immediately and without any sensory, rational warning. This silent, suffocating, unbearable pressure does not simply cause discomfort. It directly and violently attacks the human vestibular and nervous systems, inducing profound, immediate, overwhelming, uncontrollable panic, acute dizziness, extreme nausea, and a paralyzing biological sense of existential dread and immediate, imminent collapse. The invisible sound wave generated by the nearby unseen light source would have instantly stripped away every single vestige of their capacity for logical, trained, rational thought. The fear they felt was not merely psychological or visual. It was a physical, absolute, unavoidable, inescapable internal signal that absolutely compelled them to flee the source of the pressure immediately. The slashing of the tent becomes the ultimate, chilling, and undeniable physical proof of this specific internal assault. They did not open the door because their minds were so completely and utterly possessed by the immediate, overwhelming, paralyzing need to escape the unbearable internal pressure that the logical, safe exit was completely ignored, forgotten, and deemed too slow. They were fleeing a terrifying presence they could physically feel but could not logically identify, a terror generated not externally but within the confines of their own auditory and nervous systems. The abandonment of their vital, life-saving heavy clothing speaks directly to the speed and totality of the delusion. The urgent, paralyzing need to run was the body's final, absolute command, overriding all survival instincts entirely. The persistent, measurable presence of the radiation, the alpha and beta particles found concentrated heavily on the transferred clothing, acts as the verifiable, physical, atomic fingerprint of this technological assailant. The energy source that generated the infrasound must also, by scientific necessity, have been the source of the high-energy particles. The contamination confirms that the event was not natural. It was the result of a deliberate, focused, energy-intensive force, binding the psychological terror to the scientific, chilling anomaly. The invisible wave that caused the panic was simultaneously coating their outer garments with an unseen, deadly film of contamination. Finally, we address the most chilling paradox of all, the silent injuries. The immense pressure wave, the same energy that generated the infrasound and carried the radiation, could have been strong enough, focused enough, or sudden enough to cause massive internal compression. This sudden, acute pressure surge, striking their bodies at the precise moment of their chaotic flight, or while they were huddled later in the ravine, could have fractured the ribs and damaged the internal organs without necessarily tearing or breaking the skin. The crushing was an internal event, the terrifying physical result of a sudden, immense, catastrophic change in pressure that their bodies could not withstand, a final, lethal echo of the initial infrasound wave. The internal destruction was the signature of a pressure weapon. The final blank page in the logbook is merely the silent, poignant, instantaneous recording of the onset of this wave. The terror was too fast, too consuming, too physically debilitating to be recorded. The final, mundane entry represents the last moment before the sound, the light, and the pressure struck simultaneously, annihilating their ability to comprehend their tragic fate. The ultimate theory suggests a tragedy born of profound state secrecy and uncontrolled, dangerous technology. The 9 members of the Dyatlov group were the accidental, silent, freezing casualties of an experimental event high in the isolated Ural Mountains. They died not because of a storm, not because of a bear, but because they were caught directly in the invisible, devastating crosshairs of a military or scientific experiment that momentarily broke the rules of known reality, shattering their bodies and their minds with an unseen wave of pressure and lethal atomic energy. Their tragic, cold deaths remain the final, silent, profound warning against the dangers hidden in the pursuit of absolute concealed power. The mountain holds not a natural secret, but a profoundly disturbing, concealed man-made one. The devastating discovery of the Dyatlov group's fate, the discovery of the violently slashed tent, the half-naked bodies scattered down the slope, the profound crushing injuries, and the undeniable scientific evidence of atomic radiation contamination did not, in any conventional sense, conclude the mystery. In many chilling, insidious ways, it served merely as the catastrophic opening act to a far darker, far more pervasive enigma. The final, terrible act of this tragedy belongs not to the cold indifference of the Ural Mountains, but to the cold, absolute and calculating bureaucracy of the Soviet state. The state's immediate, overwhelming and coordinated reaction to the sensitive evidence was not one of transparent investigation or sincere inquiry, but one of profound, calculated suppression, a determined, systemic and relentless effort to bury the disturbing truth beneath a mountain of official silence and bureaucratic, carefully constructed lies. The sheer, undeniable scientific evidence demanded an immediate international and transparent inquiry. The radiation levels, the inexplicable crush trauma, the persistent reports of anomalous, glowing lights, these were not, under any rational assessment, the marks of a simple hiking accident or a predictable weather-related disaster. Yet, the reaction of the official state organs was swift, immediate, and entirely focused on one singular goal: containment. We must carefully examine the clear, terrifying stages of the official cover-up that began the very instant the final, crucial bodies were recovered from the deep, frozen snow of the secluded ravine. The first, most immediate, and most alarming act of suppression was the high-level classification of the case. The entire criminal investigation was quickly and abruptly transferred from the civilian police authorities, the local public prosecutors, to the secretive, powerful military and state security organs, specifically the notorious KGB. This transfer was not routine. It instantly placed the entire inquiry behind an impenetrable, absolute wall of state secrecy and military privilege. The case records were immediately classified as top secret. Potential witnesses were heavily monitored and implicitly threatened, and any piece of information deemed detrimental to the state image or referencing secret testing or flying objects was systematically redacted, edited, or outright destroyed. The wider public was instantly and completely cut off from the unfolding truth, their access replaced by the suffocating, dense silence of Soviet officialdom. The next crucial, deliberate stage was the conscious downplaying and systemic erasure of the physical evidence. Despite the clear, documented laboratory results confirming the presence of high levels of alpha and beta particle radiation on the victim's clothing, this absolutely critical scientific finding was simply omitted, intentionally and without explanation, from the final, publicly released investigation summary. The official conclusion that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force made no mention whatsoever of the atomic contamination. The fact that the most technologically incriminating piece of physical evidence was intentionally erased from the narrative confirms the knowing complicity of the highest levels of the Soviet government and regional party leadership. They were not attempting to solve a mysterious hiking fatality. They were attempting to hide the undeniable fingerprint of a secret, technological, military disaster. We must consider the unsettling trajectory of the original investigators themselves. Lev Ivanov, the lead civilian prosecutor initially assigned to the case, later gave interviews years after his retirement, confirming his deep, immediate suspicions that the incident involved either UFO activity or highly classified military weapons tests. Ivanov stated explicitly that he was directly ordered by the highest echelons of the regional party committee to immediately drop the line of inquiry involving the strange aerial spheres and any reference to unnatural causes or unidentified forces. His professional freedom to investigate was deliberately and absolutely revoked, replaced by a non-negotiable mandate to create a simple, clean, politically palatable explanation for public consumption. The core of the official lie issued by the Soviet state was the categorical conclusion that the group died due to a combination of hypothermia and a compelling natural force that they were unable to overcome. This vague, unsettling, and ultimately meaningless phrase became the official required explanation for the crush injuries, the panic, and the flight. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece of non-explanation, a phrase designed specifically to acknowledge the undeniable strangeness of the trauma without ever naming its specific, technological, or military cause. It suggested a sudden, localized storm or an avalanche, but conveniently failed to explain why the tent was cut from the inside, why the clothing was contaminated with heavy radiation, or why the internal injuries were sustained without any external signs of impact. The entire, singular purpose of the official conclusion was to misdirect, obfuscate, and permanently mislead, replacing the terrifying truth with an acceptable, cold, state-approved lie. This profound suppression extended even to the final sensitive physical resting places of the victims. The wooden coffins of the final radiation-contaminated victims were reportedly sealed permanently, and in some verified accounts, relatives were explicitly forbidden from viewing the bodies or attending the final quiet burial ceremonies. This extraordinary, chilling measure, typically reserved strictly for victims of highly contagious infectious disease or highly secretive military casualties, reinforces the severity of the classified findings. The bodies themselves were treated as dangerous, classified material, underscoring the state's desperate fear that the full, visible extent of the crushed trauma and contamination might leak into the public domain and expose the regime's secrets. The long-term, devastating impact of this official suppression is immense and enduring. By immediately seizing total control of the evidence and deliberately fabricating a false, simple conclusion, the Soviet state successfully transformed a profound, technical tragedy into a permanent, unsolvable folk myth. The cover-up ensured that the only remaining clues were fragmented, contradictory, and deeply buried within heavily redacted, inaccessible files. The lie perpetuated a climate of deep fear and professional distrust, cementing the belief that the true source of the terror was not a natural event, but a powerful, technological, and politically sensitive incident deeply concealed by the totalitarian regime. The final, chilling bureaucratic maneuver was the imposition of a massive, mandatory 25-year secrecy order on the official case files. This deliberate, profound act of historical censorship was a calculated decision to let the generation that witnessed the event and knew the victims pass away, ensuring that the full, unvarnished truth would only emerge decades later when most potential witnesses and investigators were silenced by time itself. This long-term secrecy order serves as the ultimate damning proof that the state knew precisely what happened on that mountain and that the cause was something they feared exposing more than the tragic loss of 9 young lives. The undeniable public failure of their absolute secret technological power. The lie of the compelling natural force remains the final cold epitaph to the 9 young lives lost, a chilling, persistent testament to the Soviet government's chilling willingness to sacrifice truth and human accountability for the preservation of absolute technological secrecy and state control. The terrible, suffocating silence imposed by the Soviet state in 1959, the calculated, official lie of the compelling natural force used to close the case, was never intended to be the final, complete end of the story. History, like the immense, unyielding mountain itself, eventually yields its secrets, but only under relentless, enduring pressure. The profound, chilling, and unshakable legacy of the Dyatlov Pass Incident has only grown more intense, more pervasive, and more demanding of a definitive, truthful answer with every passing decade. The true final chapter belongs not to the cold, quiet repose of the dead, but to the countless individuals, dedicated investigators, curious scientists, historians, and armchair detectives across the world who absolutely refuse to let the official, convenient lie stand as the final word. The initial 25-year secrecy order, strictly imposed and enforced by the formidable KGB, was finally begrudgingly lifted in the late 1980s amidst the political chaos and upheaval of perestroika. The subsequent cautious release of the heavily redacted, visibly incomplete original case files, the scattered, frozen photographs, the partial, often confusing testimonies, the final medical reports, did not, in any sense, bring the expected sense of closure. Instead, it only served to confirm the immediate, circulating suspicions of a massive, state-level cover-up, revealing the deliberate, intentional omissions concerning the radiation findings and the political pressure from military sources. The brief, tantalizing glimpse into the state's classified truth only intensified and magnified the core mystery, powerfully demonstrating that the decades-long silence was calculated, political, and entirely intentional, not accidental. The very act of state suppression fueled the intense global fascination with the Dyatlov Pass, cementing its status as the Rosetta Stone of Cold War-era mysteries. We must reflect deeply upon the terrible, immediate, and lasting psychological impact of the incident on the local landscape and its people. The Mansi, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, already had their own ancient, evocative name for the specific area: Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain. Following the tragedy, the pass itself was officially renamed by the authorities in honor of Igor Dyatlov, the group's earnest young leader, a tragic, cold and permanent monument to a magnificent, failed ambition. For decades, the area remained a forbidden, unsettling zone, its history circulating as a quiet, urgent warning among local hikers and mountaineers. The mountain became synonymous, not with natural challenge or achievement, but with the terrifying, inexplicable failure of human logic, training, and survival instincts in the face of an unseen force. The profound, unsettling tragedy of the 9 hikers has been repeatedly and systematically re-examined through the critical lens of modern science and advanced technology, a process of forensic, deep reinvestigation that continues vigorously to this very day. Scientists have used modern computer modeling to test the various theories that the initial Soviet inquiry was mandated by political decree to ignore. They have precisely modeled the effects of infrasound waves generated by local weather phenomena, attempting to determine if a simple, natural wind vortex could generate the required level of mass psychological terror. They have meticulously analyzed the recovered photographs and the logs, attempting to find the definitive split-second moment of panic, the precise frame where the visible, routine world shifted violently into absolute, inescapable chaos. This persistent global effort confirms the core, enduring truth. The official explanation is wholly inadequate, and the physical evidence recovered remains scientifically anomalous and deeply contradictory. The most recent comprehensive official attempt at closure, initiated by modern Russian authorities in 2019, focused heavily on confirming the natural avalanche theory, the simplest, safest, and most predictable explanation available. This modern inquiry, while commendable in its meticulous modeling of snow mechanics, wind conditions, and terrain, ultimately concluded that a sudden, small avalanche could have generated the initial sound and shock that caused the hikers to frantically slash the tent. However, even this comprehensive modern review, utilizing advanced tools, failed decisively to adequately address the most persistent and disturbing pieces of scientific evidence. The high, measurable radiation levels on the clothes, the highly specific internal crush injuries without external impact, and the consistent, documented testimonies concerning the uncanny lights. The official investigations, even decades later, and with new political mandates, seem structurally incapable or politically unwilling to fully embrace the totality of the deeply inconvenient physical evidence recovered from the pass. The legacy of the Dyatlov Pass Incident is not merely the persistent, agonizing, unanswered question of what exactly happened on that ridge, but the enduring, damning question of why the full truth was so fiercely, immediately, and successfully protected. The entire mystery stands as a profound, chilling metaphor for the entire Cold War era, a time when state secrecy was so absolute, so pervasive, that it could successfully erase the physical evidence of a terrifying event, leaving behind only the fragmented, contradictory, unassimilated clues that we are left with today. The mountain remains silent, but the files, though redacted, whisper clearly of a concealed technological terror that brutally shattered the lives of 9 young, innocent people. The most powerful, enduring legacy of the entire incident is the sheer global refusal to forget. Every single year, new documentaries are produced, meticulously researched books are written, and new expeditions venture out to the pass, all seeking the elusive, definitive final answer. The story has successfully escaped the suffocating confines of official state suppression and has achieved a global, terrifying, and profound immortality, transcending its time and place. The 9 names: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, and Yuri Yudin are now forever etched into the terrifying, permanent history of the unexplained. Their tragic, final, chaotic journey from the shared warmth of the tent to the cold, silent horror of the ravine remains the most compelling, most unsettling, and most enduring unsolved mystery of the 20th century. The final, terrible, overarching question is not whether they died of cold, but what exactly drove them out into the certainty of that cold, and what force, unseen and immense, broke their bodies without leaving a single external trace of impact. The cold, unyielding silence of the pass remains the only enduring final witness, guarding the secret of the hidden, lethal force. The long, grueling journey is now finally complete. We have descended from the exposed, unforgiving heights of Kholat Syakhl, through the desperate, chaotic confusion of the violently slashed tent, past the cold, silent witness of the great cedar tree where the fire failed, and into the grim, frozen stillness of the ravine where the final, devastating secrets lay buried. Over the course of this investigation, we have meticulously catalogued the extreme, contradictory physical destruction, the terrifying crush injuries sustained without any corresponding external impact. And we have confronted the profound, unsettling scientific anomaly, the inexplicable, documented radiation signature, and the visual terror of the uncanny lights that pierced the black, freezing night. We have, finally and conclusively, tracked the long, deliberate, historical shadow of the Soviet state, examining the specific, chilling official lie that attempted to erase the terrifying truth from the historical record forever. The enduring tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass Incident lies precisely and profoundly in its utter, categorical refusal to yield to any single, simple, or readily comprehensible answer. It stands today as a perfect, cold, and flawless vacuum of rational explanation, a singular, devastating convergence point where scientific fact, absolute government secrecy, and primal human terror meet and become so thoroughly, irrevocably intertwined that separation becomes impossible. No single, isolated theory, not simple hypothermia, not the brute force of the wind, not a localized skirmish with local inhabitants, not even a simple, small avalanche, can possibly account for the totality of the overwhelming, contradictory evidence we have meticulously reviewed. The standard explanations collapse instantly under the weight of the physical facts. The most profound, most chilling, and most inescapable reality remains the combination of the three fundamental, non-negotiable facts unearthed by the original investigators: crush trauma, radiation contamination, and unnatural panic. To truly solve the Dyatlov Pass mystery is not simply to find one easy explanation, but to identify and confirm a single, cohesive, unified force capable of generating all three of these lethal phenomena simultaneously, instantly, and silently. Only the ultimate theory, the terrifying hypothesis involving the accidental, overwhelming exposure to a high-energy, man-made pressure wave, specifically infrasound, linked to an experimental technological source, the uncanny light, and carrying lethal energetic particles, the radiation factor, comes close to explaining the full, multifaceted, horrific scope of the crime against both nature and logic. This theory accounts for the slowness of the light, the psychological effects of the panic, and the silent, internal nature of the destruction. We must reflect, one final, agonizing time, on the sheer psychological impact of the unknown that struck the tent. Imagine the 9 young hikers, disciplined, professionally strong, and highly trained, suddenly struck in the simple, total darkness of their tent. They were not victims of a slow, creeping, escalating fear. They were victims of an instantaneous biological terror that transcended every single logical defense mechanism and every rational thought pattern they possessed. The terror was not seen with the eyes, but was intensely felt, a profound, paralyzing physical pressure on the ears, on the chest, on the very soul, compelling the body to take the single most irrational action possible, to violently cut its way out of the only place of safety and flee, half naked, into the certain, consuming death of the sub-zero night. The flight was not a choice. It was an overriding biological imperative generated by an external, unseen force. The Soviet state's immediate, overwhelming response, the speed and absolute authority with which the KGB seized control, the systematic, deliberate erasure of the radiation evidence, and the immediate imposition of the 25-year secrecy order are not the actions of authorities dealing with a tragic, simple hiking mishap. They are the calculated, fearful, self-protective maneuvers of a totalitarian power attempting desperately to conceal a catastrophic technological failure that occurred on its own, highly sensitive, sovereign territory. The state feared the exposure of its secret weapons and experiments far more than it mourned the devastating loss of its young, promising citizens. The official conclusion, death by a compelling natural force, is the ultimate, cold, cynical, bureaucratic epitaph, a final act of obfuscation designed to silence professional inquiry and public curiosity forever. The profound, enduring legacy of the Dyatlov Pass has grown far beyond the physical confines of the pass itself. It has become a permanent, profound, and chilling cautionary tale for the modern era. A haunting monument to the hidden cost of the Cold War arms race, the moral vacuum created by absolute state secrecy, and the terrifying immediate vulnerability of the human body and mind to powerful, invisible, and technologically derived forces. The mystery serves as a perpetual, open, agonizing wound in the historical record, ensuring that the full, unvarnished truth of the incident can never truly be achieved until all classified files are fully and independently scrutinized. The secrecy itself is the crime. The 9 names, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault Brignoles, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, and the surviving Yuri Yudin, who carried the burden of the memory, remain permanently fixed in history. Their final, terrifying, desperate journey stands as the most compelling, complex, and tragic unsolved enigma of the 20th century. A powerful, persistent reminder that the greatest, most devastating secrets are often the ones that are carefully, systematically buried by the powerful organs of the state. The cold, desolate silence of the pass endures year after year. The snow melts and refreezes, covers and uncovers, cycles after cycle, obscuring the scars of the slash, the residue of the radiation, and the truth of the unseen lethal force. We have done all we can do. We have gathered the fragments. We have identified the source of the cover-up, and we have constructed the most plausible truth that fits the non-negotiable evidence. But the final, definitive, absolute word rests, forever unspoken, on the desolate slope of Dead Mountain. The mystery remains, a final, cold testament to the enduring, terrible power of a secret kept by the powerful. The silence of the mountain is only an echo of the deeper, more profound silence of the state. We leave the Dyatlov Pass now, but the cold silence remains. We leave behind the tangled canvas of the shredded tent, the unanswered riddle of the broken bodies, and the atomic ghosts clinging to the threads of wool. We leave behind the dark, impenetrable shadow of the state's official lie, and the endless, freezing expanse where science and terror collided. Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. The mountain has kept its secrets for over 6 decades, guarding the terrible, unrecorded truth of that final night. The wind whispers no answers, the snow reveals no witnesses, and the logbook remains perpetually blank. What began as a simple hike ended as a haunting testament to forces unseen and dangers concealed. The mystery of the 9 lost lives is not resolved. It is simply passed on. We can only stand in the cold, look up at the vast, indifferent Siberian sky, and remember the young adventurers, their laughter, their ambition, and their final, desperate run from a terror that science cannot name and bureaucracy refused to acknowledge. The file is closed. The truth is not.